But when you get to the Thessalonian passage, Paul says that the day of the Lord is not going to show up until the apostasy or the departure takes place. The following way is how it's translated in KJV, until this takes place and the man of laws and scissors is revealed. Pre-tribbers kind of pick up on this and say this word could be translated as departure, meaning rapture, as in Christians departing from planet Earth. Yes, that's a possibility. We could look at that. But given the fact that this is a very seldom used word, only shows up one other time in the Bible, within the context of the other one, which we know for sure is not physical removal, physical departure, it's definitely spiritual apostasy, right? The one that we would be familiar with when we say apostasy in the spiritual sense. There's no reason to think that, or to force that a different meaning on the Thessalonian passage. In other words, it doesn't have to mean physical departure. It can also mean spiritual departure. And that's the way that most rapturist, rapture type discussions go, is that they believe it's talking about a spiritual departure from the Christian faith, a spiritual departure from the true faith, and that's the position I hold to. But I've heard others say that it could mean physical departure, but I haven't seen that in the context yet. But when the time comes, we'll have those discussions, and we can entertain why maybe that might be a good fit. So those are all the Greek terms for the technical part of our discussion. Now, let's go back over to where we're going to be parked out tonight for the most part. So moving past John Piper's answer to what is rapture, he talked about what it is. It is the snatching away, the catching up of believers into the air to meet Christ, and then quickly coming back down to planet Earth in our new bodies to populate the millennial time period, which takes place from his perspective at the very end of the 70th week of Daniel, so near the end of the 7 years, and around the time of Armageddon. And thus, he's a post-tribulationist in that perspective. Let's continue to look at post-tribulationism before we jump directly into pre-trib and then finally into pre-wrath, which is the position that I hold to. This idea of post-tribulationism and its contrast to pre-trib, so post to trib, of course, only one of these views can be right. When I look at the post-trib perspective and then I look at the pre-wrath perspective, I can see that there might be some really nuanced differences between those, because neither one of us knows exactly when the rapture or the day of the Lord is going to commence. We don't know exactly when the second coming is going to happen. We know it's near the end of the 70th week. Both of us agree that's closer to the end rather than closer to the beginning, like pre-tribbers teach. And the mid-trib position, mid-tribber, if you've noticed, I'm not spending a lot of time talking about the mid-trib position, because in most theological circles, the mid-trib has been kind of subsumed under the pre-wrath position because of how similar in location they are to each other, both being not near the polar ends, the bookends of the 70th week of Daniel. Like the post-trib is on one end, the pre-trib is on the other end. Mid-trib and pre-wrath are both located near the center of the 70th week. And so for that reason, a lot of mid-tribbers have just abandoned that view and simply moved either over to pre-wrath or something to that effect. But I want to continue looking for one more week at post-trib before I move directly into pre-trib. And the reason I'm looking at post-trib tonight is because of its strong contrast against pre-trib. But this time I want to look at it through the lens of one of the most famous pre-tribbers, whose name is, let's see, where is it here? President and professor of systematic. Well, give me a second. I'm going to change the view of the page. It's Walvoord, Doctor. Let me see if I can blow up his picture, and you can see who I'm talking about. This gentleman right here, John F. Walvoord. He's a longtime president of Dallas Theological Seminary, and he was, as this page is talking, he's one of the most prominent evangelical scholars of his generation. He's considered perhaps the world's foremost interpreter of Bible prophecy, so eschatology, and he's best known for his best-selling works on Bible prophecy. And he is a pre-tribulationist, right? He believes in pre-tribulational rapture. I disagree with pre-trib rapture, but I highly respect his research into this field. And so we're going to borrow his notes as been reproduced on Bible.org's website and resource for us. And I'm going to read through it fairly nonstop. He talks about the rapture and the day of the Lord in 1 Thessalonians 5. And the reason I'm bringing this passage into the discussion, I want you to kind of perk your ears up for this part. He's going to take the pre-trib position, and thus he's going to try to show you why the post-trib doesn't work. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm putting this up here, is because we just got through learning about the post-trib position from John Piper. And so if you only listen to one session, you might think, wow, that's it, post-trib, that makes sense. But now we're going to look at why, from a pre-tribber, why post-trib doesn't work, right? And then next week, we'll begin to look at pre-trib, and we'll dig more deeply into it so we can define it before we eventually turn into pre-wrath and show you why I think pre-trib doesn't work, right? Again, I'm a pre-wrather, so I'm saying that the other positions have weaknesses. Well, let's listen to Dr. Walvoord, who is going to highlight some of the weaknesses of the post-trib position. But he's going to do it by explaining that the rapture and the day of the Lord bears significance in our study, because as we're going to find out, a good number of Bible students, me included, believe that the rapture and the day of the Lord are very close to one another. Very close to one another, as in perhaps even separated only by a part of a day, like as in day and night, or one event kicks off the other event. By comparison, let me show you this last chart, and this is another reason why it's relevant. When you look at pre-trib, all right, this is Dr. Walvoord's position. He's a pre-tribber. This is, remember, the most popular position on planet Earth today. This is the one most widely held by most Christians. It's the one that a lot of people are abandoning and jumping ship to post-trib or even pre-wrath. But pre-trib, where's the rapture? The rapture's on the far right. It's at the beginning of the 7 years. Where's the second coming? It's on the, let's try that one again. Where's the rapture? It's on the far left, right? It's at the beginning of the 7 years. Where's the second coming? It's on the far right. So these events are separated by 7 years. But notice that the entire 7-year slice by most pre-trib standards is described as either the tribulation, the great tribulation, or God's wrath. So the 3.5 years and 3.5 years might be tribulation and great tribulation, but for all intents and purposes, all of the 7 years is assumed by this view as trib, and God's wrath is a name that's labeled as a label that's used in conjunction or synonymous with tribulation. And thus, when the Bible tells us that we're not destined to wrath, like 1 Thessalonians 5:9, a very famous passage, God hath not destined us to wrath, but to obtain salvation, something to that effect, I'm paraphrasing. Well, pre-tribbers jump on that and say, well, since we're not destined to wrath, God has not appointed us to wrath, that means we must be taken out of the way prior to wrath, and if the entire 7-year tribulation equals wrath, well, then we must exit the scene at the very beginning. But germane to our study that we're going to be looking at is that the rapture takes place, and then wrath or tribulation begins, meaning the events are right next to each other. And this is important for the pre-trib position because of the language that we're going to read about in Thessalonians that Paul uses, talks about those two events. He talks about rescuing us or delivering us, and he also talks about paying back those who persecute us, those who afflict us, paying back with affliction those who afflict us. The order is reversed. He talks about the affliction first, and then he talks about delivering us. And John Piper hit on that last week. We looked at that. But very important, pre-tribbers say that we must be rescued first, and then the wrath of God is poured out. And this must take place at the beginning of the 7th week, because God's wrath, it spans the entire 7-year slice. But when we compare this to the post-trib view, if the entire 70th week of Daniel, the entire 7 years is God's wrath, well, then notice that the rapture takes place after the wrath of God. The order is reversed. We have wrath being poured out on this chart first, or tribulation, and then the rapture is post-trib, or since trib and wrath are used interconnectedly or sometimes conflated with one another in many discussions, then we could say that classic post-tribbers are also post-wrathers, which means the rapture takes place post-wrath or post-trib. If that's the case, well, then we would find verses that would seem to support that. But Dr. Walvoord is going to explain to us that this isn't the case. So that was part of why I'm kind of prepping you so we can understand what he's about to say. All right, we're about halfway into our hour-long study, so I need to get going so we can hit all of this and study this entire article. It's a bit lengthy, but I'm going to try and read it without pausing and explaining a lot. It's fairly self-explanatory. So, rapture and the day of the Lord, which, from my understanding, are events that are essentially going to happen back to back. There's not going to be a big, long 7-year gap between them. So in this regard, I agree with Dr. Walvoord here, who is a very famous pre-tribber. I believe I agree with pre-tribbers, and therefore I disagree with classic post-tribbers that the wrath of God takes place in before the rapture takes place. My understanding of the chronology is that the rapture is first, and then the day of the Lord, i.e. the wrath of God, is second in sequence, in chronology. By the way, in all fairness, Joel Richardson, who's one of those 5 gentlemen that I keep flashing on the screen, he is a post-tribber, but he departs from classic post-tribulationism in this regard. He does not believe that the wrath of God is poured out first and then the rapture takes place. He believes that the entire 7 years is more kind of a tribulation period, and then near the very end, the rapture rapidly takes place. We go up real quick, we meet the Lord in the air, we come back down real quick, and then the wrath is poured out in rapid succession. And so he still places chronologically rapture in front of wrath, but the wrath is drastically shortened. There's not a lot of time for the wrath to be poured out. The trumpets and the bowl judgments that we read about in Revelation, starting in chapter 8, moving through about chapter 15, that would encompass the trumpets and the bowls. But from his perspective, he calls it a hybrid of the post-trib and the pre-wrath. So he retains the chronology that I do, but he puts most of it at the far right near the Armageddon / second coming, like classic post-tribbers do. Okay, so let's read about Dr. Walvoord's rejection of post-tribulationism as seen through the topic of the rapture and the day of the Lord in 1 Thessalonians 5. And I'm doing this because we just got through studying Dr. John, I don't know if he's a doctor or not, but Pastor John Piper's perspective on the rapture and the day of the Lord in 1 Thessalonians 5. And according to John Piper, because of the language that shows up there, this is definitive proof that this must take place near the end of the 70th week. In other words, it's Armageddon language. Is that the case? Let's read. Okay, so we've got Dr. Walvoord's credentials here, president and professor of systematic theology, Dallas Theological Seminary. Okay, at least I think that might be it. Or he's a former one, and the guy who wrote this is the current one. Okay, and this is again at Bible.org, and it originally showed up in another Bibliotheca Sacra, a kind of a publishing series that's available for Christians to read through. Okay, let's just read through like this, and again, I'll try to read largely without stopping because it's self-explanatory. These are Dr. Walvoord's notes as been reproduced. There's a few typos in here when I read through it last time, so I'll try to get past those. And also, again, Dr. Walvoord is a pre-tribber, and he's going to argue for pre-trib. He is rejecting the post-trib, and he's trying to highlight the weaknesses of the post-trib. The relationship of 1 Thessalonians 5 to the rapture has been debated by both pre-tribulationists and post-tribulationists with an amazing variety of opinions. The problem centers in the definition of the day of the Lord and its relationship to the rapture. Because there are differences of interpretation among both pre-tribulationists and post-tribulationists, generalizations are inevitable. The center of the problem is, first of all, the question of what the day of the Lord means. A second question is why the day of the Lord is introduced immediately after discussion of the rapture in the Thessalonian passages. So just let me back up. If you read 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and then turn right around and keep reading 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, right one right after the other, remembering that Paul didn't actually write chapter breaks between in his original letter, then contextually, the rapture is spoken of in 1 Thessalonians 4, right? We will meet the Lord in the air, etc., etc. Rapture / resurrection. Remember, those two events are synonymous. Rapture and resurrection are basically the same thing. The only difference between the two words are rapture would be the movement, the upward movement of the living saints at the time when Jesus comes back, versus resurrection would be the movement of the dead saints up to meet the Lord in the air. Of course, they go first. They precede those who are alive. So resurrection actually does take place chronologically first, and then immediately on the heels of that, in other words, probably on the same day, right at the same moment, in the twinkling of an eye, so you wouldn't even see the movement. But the living saints, the living believers, are caught up into the air. So that's the rapture aspect of resurrection, the part that was a mystery to the Old Testament readers and writers, but was only revealed by the time of the New Testament, namely to Paul. Which is why you don't find rapture in the Old Testament. It's a very easy argument to answer. It's because it was a mystery. God hid it from the Old Testament saints. But you do find resurrection. It's all over the Bible. It's all over the Old Testament. So this is the discussion. The rapture is introduced, Day of the Lord is introduced immediately after the discussion of the rapture, which suggests a chronology as well, right? Rapture first, then Day of the Lord, in that order, which is what pre-tribs take, pre-raptors take, mid-tribbers take as well. It's only the classic post-tribbers that disagree on those orders there. So let's keep reading. Third question is the meaning of specific statements relating to the time of the rapture. All right, let's get into the meat of this article here, which is the meaning of the day of the Lord. And you're thinking, isn't this a rapture discussion? Ariel, I thought you're talking about rapture. Yes, I am. But in order for you to appreciate rapture, we have to appreciate two aspects. One is the one I just mentioned. Rapture is a mystery. It's hidden from the Old Testament. Understand that? Okay. Rapture was hidden from the Old Testament readers and writers. It's revealed by Yeshua to Paul by his Holy Spirit, and then also revealed to John in the book of Revelation. Although he doesn't use the word rapture and the snatching away and catching up, things like that, we have the large multitude that shows up in various places, like, say, Revelation chapter 7 or chapter 7. A large multitude that shows up in heaven after he talks about the 144,000, and it's natural to follow that chronology to conclude that this resurrection, this multitude that shows up in heaven, is the resurrected church. Well, one main aspect that you need to latch onto is that rapture is a mystery, so it was hidden from the Old Testament saints. But the other aspect is the flip side of that. Resurrection, which is the resurrecting of those who are believers in Christ, is found in the Old Testament. It's also found in the New Testament, but it is found in verses in the New Testament within proximity of an event known as the Day of the Lord, which is all over the Old Testament. It is featured prominently. In fact, if you look at all the prophecies in the Old Testament, the Day of the Lord is one of the central end-time prophecies. And we're talking not just about the near-term end of the Lord, a Day of the Lord, which could have been any number of events that took place in Israel's past history. So there are different days of the Lord in a temporal sense, where they were kind of like physical deliverance from her physical enemies, her political enemies, geographical enemies, etc. So like deliverance from Babylon, deliverance from the Assyrians, deliverance from the Egyptians. Those are types of the Day of the Lord, where God swoops in, rescues Israel, and then pours out judgment on any given big baddie who carted off Israel into exile or punished Israel, or put them in slavery like Egypt did, whatever. So the Exodus event is a type of Day of the Lord, where God drowned the Pharaoh in the Red Sea. That's a type of Day of the Lord, but that's a temporal version. There is what we're going to be properly labeling an eschatological Day of the Lord, which, when you begin to read through all those Old Testament passages like Isaiah, Zephaniah, Joel, Malachi, Zechariah, things like that, you're going to begin to realize that these events that are being described are are events that haven't happened yet, and the magnitude and who they impact must be something that hasn't taken place yet. Besides, when we get to some of the heavy passages like Zephaniah or Joel, the succession of what happens after the day of the Lord are promises to Israel of this settled peace from all her enemies, never to be subjugated again, never to be exiled again, never to have to worry about the destruction and trampling of Jerusalem by the Gentiles and things like that. And obviously that hasn't happened historically yet. So we know that there is an eschatological application of the day of the Lord that features in the Old Testament that's also carried over into the New. Now, why is that important for us? It's because when we get to the New Testament, we find that the rapture and the day of the Lord happen very closely to one another. And if the Bible's taken in this literal fashion, then rapture takes place first, and then day of the Lord takes place next. And actually excuse me, the rapture actually initiates the day of the Lord. So that when we look at the timing of the rapture, we're actually looking at the timing of the initiation of the day of the Lord. Not the duration of the day of the Lord, and not the end of the day of the Lord, but the initial timing, the kickoff of the day of the Lord. What is the day of, when does the day of the Lord begin? And if we can answer that question, then we can answer the question when the rapture happens, according to most Bible students. So that's why we're we're parking on this. All right, let's see how far I can get into this. I can see I might have to break this off and make this a part 2. All right, this is Dr. John Walvoord, who is a pre-tribber. He's going to argue against post-trib rapture. References to the day of the Lord abound in the Old Testament and occur occasionally in the New. So he's got to define the day of the Lord first, and so I'm going to kind of read down through this somewhat quickly. Virtually everyone agrees that the judgments related to the second coming are in some sense a part of the day of the Lord. Definitions of the word day vary from a specific event, such as a 24-hour day, to an extended period of time stretching all the way from the rapture to the end of the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Let me interject one more time. When we're looking at rapture and day of the Lord, it is really best, and I think this is held by just about every person in my discussion per view, pre-trib, mid-trib, pre-wrath, and post-trib. All of us have the same perspective that I'm about to describe. Rapture is an event. It's a very fast event, very quick. According to Paul's terminology, it happens in the twinkling of an eye, right? Very quickly at the last trump, which I do not believe is the 7th trumpet, but we'll get into that in time.